I would like to say welcome to our guest today, Quilian at Pratt Institute. But as you have been able to tell from this week's readings and video, has been involved in a lot of remarkable work. So we're really lucky to have him with us today. Our goals for today are to have our group lead us through discussions. So you'll be sharing your screen. And I invite you all to take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Coffee.
Right on. So thanks for joining us, Quilian. There are maybe 5 or 6 of us. I know Maya and Grace, Nicholas have their videos on, but yeah, we took a look and read the works that you sent us, and I know Kofi sent you those questions. So I think we'll go ahead and kind of jump in and ask them. For the other students, we prepared 4 questions to ask Quilian, but also left some room at the end. So as we have this conversation, if anything comes up, I don't know if you want to save them to the end or just kind of keep them in mind. I think there'll be space to kind of have a conversation. I can go ahead and share my screen and get us started. Can you all see this? Right on.
Yeah.
Sharing a screen is always kind of weird for a conversation, but I'm going to click grid mode and expand it. So give me a sec. But yeah, so first one is just kind of getting to know you a little bit. We've certainly kind of learned a little bit about you from the readings, but what or who inspired you to pursue a career in architectural and urban design? What is it that motivates you and energizes your work today? You can just kind of give us the broad strokes, I suppose.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much. Thanks, Coffee. Thanks, Evan. Thank you for all of you. I told Coffee earlier, but I think it's bears repeating that it was really nice to see such thoughtful questions, very engaging in a funny way. I'm like, I wonder how I'm going to answer that. So I was curious about the answer myself. So they were fun. Okay. So what or who inspired you to pursue a career in architectural and urban design? I mean, I'm going to share with you a little bit of a story. I actually came to architecture a little bit roundabout in that it was never my dream. I never really I'm not one of those people that says Lincoln Logs and Legos, and I always wanted to be an architect. I kind of didn't. I never even thought about it very much. What happened was that I finished high school and I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but you know, I always thought that interesting people went into the military, so I joined the military. So I went to the Air Force. I was, it was a moment in time when I was a kid that read, weirdly enough, like Hemingway bios and things like that, and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. So I joined the Air Force from Miami to South Dakota. Had never seen snow before and arrived to South Dakota in a blizzard. But the 4 years there really made me think about a few things. I left the military 6 months early because I had a scholarship waiting for me in Miami or in Florida, because I went to University of Florida, not Miami. And I still thought that I wanted to do art, and I wanted to go into the art department, very until the last almost minute. And one of the last experiences I had while in the military was 2 things. I took a sociology course with a Native American professor whose name quite honestly escapes me now. It was like 25 years ago or more, who was part of the American Indian movement. And at the same time, for my job, I was working with a colonel from the Red Horse team, the engineering team that builds, that is basically the Army Corps of Engineer or the CVs, the engineering corps for the Air Force. And we were building wells in the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, one of the poorest places in America. So I was learning about things like the Wounded Knee massacre as I was literally beginning to see some of the effects of that kind of thing today. I was literally seeing, communities without running water, etc. So it made me wonder. It made me think this as I came back to Rapid City, where I lived with a whole bunch of people, is that the built environment is designed that someone had to think about where to put these things, that it mattered, and that doing that job required both a certain amount of artistry, but also something else. So it began to take over for me than art. That art began to feel a little bit too selfish or something, while architecture had the potential to do other things and explore and think about and potentially do something about some of the inequities that I was observing in the reservation. So that was a little bit what motivates and energizes my work today. In a funny way, those initial ideas haven't changed all that much. It's still about kind of thinking about systems. And I came in then with that systems thinking and a little bit even of I would say a beginning of a political framework to think about things, meaning that understanding that things always have consequences. In a funny way, also the military taught me that. In the military, the military is a socialist construct, and that is everything. You understand the system pretty well. It's told to you. So for me, it's still an interest to try to understand the invisible and visible forces that shape our built environment, that shape what we do. That is still probably one of the most important things for me, and find ways to both share that with other people and to act on it, and act on it with beauty at times, with passion and intensity in others.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. I think that definitely comes through in the video that we watched and the readings that we had from you. It makes a lot of sense. I think in talking about values and kind of this approach that you had, this kind of gets us to our first, the other one's a question, but this one kind of getting to the meat of it. We watched a video that you produced for Dark Matter University, and you talked about the architecture lobby in that, and they have a different set of values and priorities than a lot of conventional institutions, both in design as well as just around. I was curious if you could speak a little bit about how these organizations engage with status quo institutions in a productive way, and kind of jumping off of that, do you think they should, or is there another way that they should orient themselves within these systems?
So this is an interesting thing. It's a very important question because it gets at something that I think about often, right? And something that I think about often is the failures of the 60s and the commune in a way. I'm gonna go into somewhere weird. I'm gonna begin by sharing with you. There's something really interesting that there's a podcast by a historian named Mike Duncan that I really like called Revolutions Podcast. He also did a whole thing on Rome. He basically went from Rome when it's like from the mythics beginning until the Western Roman Empire fell. And that word is debatable. when did the Western Roman Empire fall? Maybe never, maybe always, I don't know. But in the Revolutions podcast, these kind of questions keep coming up all the way from the English Civil War and Cromwell to the French Revolution. Is like, how much do you work with systems? How much do you work without them? And in the specific American context, and obviously Mike Duncan doesn't get into that, but I do recommend that. He has a book on Lafayette that I find particularly also interesting around some of these questions. And how much Lafayette's own kind of life changed according to the revolution that he was a part of or not a part of. He became the most radical to the most conservative almost consistently. Very kind of interesting, but it's about structures, and I completely agree with you, because although I have participated with these groups that push institutions, I'm actually an institutionalist. And I believe that we should be working within institutions and we should be pushing them to do better. And I believe that for a reason, and is that most people are going to interact with those institutions, and that the political moment of the 60s, one of its failures was the idea of the commune. The idea that all we have to do is create our alternative processes, our alternatives. That the idea of the alternative allowed the system to then be taken over by others, right? Instead of applying that level of to me it's almost criticality. I mean, obviously I have point of view and all that. I mean, I care about labor. I care, for me, these things are about, quite honestly, about criticality. Obviously, they fall within a kind of political spectrum. I'm not dumb about that either. I'm not gonna say I'm apolitical because that makes no sense. But I also see myself as someone that is just trying to critically and push for them and really with a humanist point of view. So for me, it's important that these institutions are asking these kind of humanist questions. And in the case of Dark Matter University, really bringing up questions about race. And one of the things that I like to really, one of the things that Dark Matter University has really clarified and conversations, et cetera, is the idea of even implied subjectivities and the subjectivities that we might live with in our everyday life and we don't notice. So the role of these institutions for me, and again, these are collectives, so my word in this is as much as anyone else's, but for me, they are useful tools to push, to imagine if they end up becoming, I mean, for example, the architecture lobby for me is simply this, is doing the job the AIA cannot do, will not do, which is to actually represent architects. The AI represents architecture, not architects. And do you guys understand the difference between them? So it's about how to grow the pie, right? How to create more economic opportunity for architectures. Well, in general, in theory, it would lead more jobs for architects, et cetera. But the reality, especially now, is that architects require a series of things: health insurance, better work environments, better policies around parental leave. The architects require certain human level sets of things that architecture as an abstraction will not provide. So that's the difference between the two. And so similarly with Dark Matter University, and this one, and for Dark Matter University, quite honestly, and for both, Architecture Lobby basically set itself as an aside to push the institutions, create new ones, create unions, create cooperatives. So both, and the both and I'll finish that with maybe, that the idea of both and is incredibly important, and performance has been important to a lot of this organizing work. But for Dark Matter University, it's an active conversation we're having. How much should we create alternative things, create summer schools, create our own structures, or how much should we continue to work within institutions? Some of the changes is, for example, the not taught by me, but Justin Garrett Moore, Carrie Hackett, Jerome Haffer have all been teaching courses between Yale and Tuskegee or Howard and Columbia. And some of those courses are changing the way that the institutions work. And so it's incredibly important as well. So I hope that was helpful. It was a both answer because both things are necessary. But I am at heart, at least, a person that I want some of the changes that I would like to see collectively done in the world to really to be visible by as many people as possible, and small communes don't allow for that. So it also requires more structural change.
That makes sense, tying back into like the systems approach of like, these are huge systems that we're dealing with. So I appreciate that. I think Nicholas was going to jump in and ask the next one. If you want to hop in there, Nicholas.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Quilian, for giving your perspective on everything. Due to your hand in creating the Architecture 2030 palette, how do you feel about the trajectory of current climate crisis since Architecture 2030's establishment? And do you feel as though designers and architects have done enough to implement the curated palette in order for us to achieve a zero carbon built environment? And if not, what do you suggest we do more as architects?
Thank you for asking about this time in my life. I really, working with Edward Masria, one of I call them one of the godfathers of sustainability in New Mexico, was an incredibly important thing. So for me, and this is being recorded, but hopefully, one of the things that is our original work actually missed a little bit was, again, the social dimension of this. That I've always wondered with Architecture 2030 if it was focusing a little to Edward Masria, the founder of Architecture 2030. He's now probably closer to 80 than not, and still probably has more energy than me. I can tell you that. I don't know about it. I definitely more energy than me, so a couple of things. Number one, I think that that what Architecture 2030 was perfect. Perfect in its moment. It woke us up. It didn't allow similarly architects to see the problem over there, centered it in what we do and what we can do about it, which is we design things, and the things we do require energy over the long haul. The materials that we use have energy lives. So how to think about all that. I think that I'm not sure how much the palette is actually used, because I stopped working as soon as the tool was launched. I've been going back to it lately, actually at the behest of a project I'm working on that includes the AI. And thinking about it, I mean, I still think it's an incredibly important tool. But I wonder if today, maybe starting with some conversations about maybe, do you need to build at all? What else could you be doing? Maybe we should have done more interior design renovation principles, more kind of what to do with existing infrastructure and other tools like that. I think that might be one thing that I would add on to it. And I think that generally, I think the big principle that I still think about whenever is that design itself can help us diminish a lot of the energy we use. And I did see that it changes, and traditional societies, so use less resources. It doesn't mean that it's a nostalgic approach of going back and doing the things that were done in the past. But I mean, for example, sometimes I look at those air cooling towers in the desert. I think Ethiopia and places in the Middle East and North Africa, and I'm still amazed that those things exist. The way that water was used in a lot of places in like Andalusia or in southern Spain as a way of cooling the environment, that there are still tools that could be learned. And I think that maybe is, and where we are still maybe failing is how some of those tools can scale up to a place like right now I'm in New York City. I'm looking at the Empire State Building out my window and the new One Vanderbilt. So how those kind of tools and those can scale up to buildings like that, because at the end of the day, that is probably the game.
Right on. So in a lot of your projects, there's this theme of community engagement and particularly agency with local communities. So talking about not just talking with, but empowering and using that. This is a long question. Oh, went the wrong way. I guess what are the ways in which these emphases drive your design processes, and to what extent do they define success in a given project? Do you have any examples of things like that? And I'll just go through the whole question, but don't feel free to take it. Don't need to take it all in one bite. Are there any strategies you have for emerging professionals seeking to serve diverse neighborhoods and communities through design, and who don't want these well-intended efforts to adversely affect intended community through any of the ways that we could? What do you actually have for us?
Both really interesting questions. I'm going to start with the second one first, if that's okay. And is that for folks really maybe looking into doing that kind of thing, what I would say, I mean, consider joining people that are already doing that kind of work. So you don't do it, but you're, and then it's not even quite a clientelistic model, but there are folks already working on multiple issues. So, you know, and go and depending on the issue, you can humbly go and ask what's needed. I remember actually right around Occupy Wall Street, and to be honest, this is not an example that because I ended up not continuing to work, but thinking the exact same question, I started going. This was like 2 months before Occupy Wall Street, to a group called Organizing for Occupation, where a group of people that had experienced homelessness in the past were organizing and coming up with the solutions driven by and based on their experiences and with those people. So it wasn't a charitable thing, but they were telling you what they needed and you would acting on that. So I think that there are people doing the work. You're not inventing it. You're not reimagining. So I think that that I would do that. I would go to where people already are, whether, and again, institutions, nonprofits, small community groups, and see what's needed. I also would say that don't come in thinking that the only thing you can provide is what you're being trained to do, whatever, you know, landscapes, buildings, urban design. Maybe the tools that you have been taught can be used in other ways. I mean, one of the things that I always found super interesting is C2 Studio. I forgot the name of the other group. Oh, Forensic Architecture, where they're using the urban design tools to uncover crimes against humanity. So like they're working with the UN, with human rights, you know, like they're doing tons of things. Okay, for the second one, I think that the question of agency is incredibly important. And I want to say one thing about this is that I am also agency is giving a certain amount of control over your situation, right? Whatever that is. And I think that that's basically a democratic process. And democratic processes should also invite conflict. And I think I like the way you framed that, even in I think maybe it's the first question around productive conflict. That in a democratic society, none of us are going to get 100% of what we want, right? So that how do we create spaces that both encourage the negotiations and maybe are able to, and those negotiations can affect that space over the long term? That's really how I look at it. And even my engagements, I don't know if you ever, I use words like games, but they're really actually meant to elicit a little bit of conflict within communities, and sometimes even drive some contradictions. For example, again, going back to people that face homelessness or are living through it. No one ever wants a homeless person in their park, and sometimes you have to push back against it. They're citizens like everyone else. Just because you don't want them there doesn't make them any less worthy of being there. So it's not like communities are always right. Sometimes you have to be a good facilitator. You have to listen, you have to learn, but there's also principles that we all should drive into. And I think for me, and I like the idea of success, every project has every skill, there are projects where I intently began it. For example, the Corona Plaza project, that's Corona Plaza is behind me. I told the people, they wanted me to sketch a solution. I said, I'm not doing design for this. All I want, the design project is talking to people, these moments, these conflicts, these games. But for some of the architectural things I've done is, for me, success is that my design, my work is the first sentence in a much longer conversation. And that maybe like the things that actually get done might end up being very different than what I even envisioned, but might look that way. So in this, imagine that there's a basic infrastructure that either allows change over time, or that people can have it in ways that I haven't even thought about, but that some of the basics are there for that to happen. The rules of the game.
For sure. I like how in answering these questions, the first one your first response was thinking kind of almost felt like you're coming to these organizations as a private citizen, in addition to being like this professional and saying, hey, what can I do? Kind of stepping out of that role. And then the second one is thinking about the role of facilitator. So just helpful to kind of think about that in those two pieces. And I'm sure they blend quite a bit. Get us to our last structured question. Kind of taking all these things and wrapping them up. What is one of the biggest struggles for you as an activist and designer? And I'll lump in there private citizen. Do the communities you seek to empower feel hesitant to get involved or share their perspectives? Do partners you work with or institutions you work for push back against the activist design strategies and the values that you're putting forth in your work?
These are all good questions. So let's take one at a time. Biggest struggle. I think the first one and the last one have a lot of kind of in common. Let's see, but I'm going to take one at a time because otherwise it's going to be hard for me. But what is one of the biggest struggles for you? I think that is how to push buttons without pushing them so hard that the conversation stops. How to do it without fully kind of stepping into a role that maybe is inappropriate. For this, I'm going to share actually, again, this Corona Plaza, but in this case, the studio I taught. After I worked with the Queens Museum, the next thing I did was kind of realize that there was a big business improvement district coming, create a studio around that. And honestly, I obviously had a point of view, which is that the research that I've seen says business improvement districts work for what they were meant to do, which is kind of create malls out of cities. They do three things. They do those things well, but the questions are, what are you giving up for those three things? The three things being security, like to put a security guard or I mean, do you all know business improvement districts? Should I go? I'm going to explain in 5 seconds, which is basically is a commercial district that taxes itself. The tax goes to government and comes back into a nonprofit or some organization that then can do three things: put up signage, so kind of create some sort of homogenous thing, put security, and pick up trash more often. And then they can create rules around that space. In the specific area I was working in, it meant that, for example, the business improvement district in this area of Queens that's full of immigrants, so often undocumented immigrants, is the only place that you couldn't have street vending, a lifeline for this community. So giving that up and why this group could say something like that, and what, the streets are in theory public space, right? So it was an extra layer of rules put on that public space. Okay, all this to say that I invited both the business improvement director, I invited the people fighting against her, I invited, we work with undocumented immigrants, we work with so many people in this one that trying to be an honest broker was important. Understanding that just because of that is like the current question around journalism, right? Like complete unbiasedness is not always reality. Like you can't just be an observer when someone is saying blue and the other person is saying, and we're gonna burn it all. Like those two things are they're not equal. So how to be able to have an honest conversation, truly try to bring people and things in, and try to create that. So I don't know, that I think that's quite honestly what I struggle, and I'll pick that up again in the third one. The communities you seek, the only thing I will talk about the second question is I don't really seek to empower anyone, because I'm not sure I have power. In some contexts, quite honestly, it is important to understand when you do, and be conscious of it. Like, for example, sometimes when I go to other countries, just they literally, maybe I'll share this quick story, which is I went to parts of Colombia that usually people can't get into. I had just left Harvard, and just the name Harvard got me into the president's palace and the house of a drug lord in a community that we were looking and doing research on. So that is a certain amount of kind of, yeah, that was intense. That was, we were doing journalism and doing research in this community, and the only way you could go into the community is if the evangelical church and the local drug lord allows you in. So those two, and up to a certain point, the UN also, I knew someone in the UN. So, but to the larger question of communities, I think there are a couple of things. Number one, it really depends where. Here in New York City, there's just so many people like looking at communities and working that communities are tired. It's like you go into Red Hook these days and people are like, another academic with a whole bunch of students doing their engagements and their plans. They're not gonna wanna talk to you. So there's a real, I think that this is a really great question because it brings up the ethics around doing this kind of work in academia and outside of it. And I think that the conversation here is how do you work with a community? What kind of long-term relationship do you create? What, again, I think usually what I've done, because I also don't believe in total localism, that I can only work with my community in my place, because that would restrict me as an immigrant quite a bit, right? And I think it's more about going to where people are already, and so there's other ways of finding that like the local, maybe the localism doesn't have to come from you, and you can have honest conversations with people that are already working on these issues. Okay, so all this to say, in New York City, very hard. When I go to Ohio and I go to communities like Youngstown, Ohio, Warren, Ohio, people really want to tell you their experience. Like literally we would go and the newspaper would publish it. So it changes a lot, and it's for a couple of reasons. It's a community, and again, I'm gonna mention politics without mentioning it, but there's a reason why that community has changed radically from one political party to the other recently. They are feeling left behind. They're feeling unheard. They're feeling all these sets of things that we keep hearing in the news. And the reality is that they have been, and that there's political football playing there. And quite honestly, one of the things that I always wonder is if there was someone that could bring together and have understand that the woes of a place like Youngstown, Ohio are not that different from the woes of immigrant communities in Sunset Park. Like we could have maybe a different kind of political conversation about what these spaces mean. What disinvestment, gentrification, relationships to services and economic systems would be very different. And I was working in both places at the same time. One community where literally in Sunset Park, where maybe I won't share this, but basically I was told that I was not wanted by people that in theory were my community, Latin Americans, immigrants. Because they saw me as creating hipster spaces for people. We were doing new public spaces through the Department of Transportation. I literally thought that we were gonna get picketed and it was gonna not be good. It ended up being fine, and the project was fine. Again, it was a small project, just kind of investigating how to create new public spaces. But we did listen, and we made them we took away all the hipster design elements. We weren't even done, but we did it all about work. And quite honestly, I think it ended up a better project. It became about understanding how urban systems work and celebrating those through design. Not about stopping, not about ping pong, not about street vendors, not about any of those kind of things. It was literally about the movement of water and people and safely and cleanly. But at the same time, I was working in Youngstown and Warren, where the disinvestment is so vast that areas was the Silicon Valley of its day. One of the first cars ever made was made there, and for anyone that might like cars, the Packard was built there, right? And so anything that you would come in, they wanted to share, and they wanted you to both carry the story potentially to other places, They wanted to think about how design could work. And it's one reason why I actually know coffee. Think about things like how collectives and cooperatives could be used to develop the community. All these sets of things were actually something that people wanted to do. And I'm gonna say something, I don't mean this as a critique per se, but I was working, and then after I did that from a school from New York, I ended up moving to a local school to continue my work in Ohio. But all the architects from that area just wanted to work with robots and make funky shapes. So in a funny way, like they were leaving that space. We were getting grants from the Department of Labor. We were getting grants to do things and try to reimagine what some of these spaces looked like. I almost wish I could have given that work a little bit more time. And finally, I'm sorry, I'm going long, but the partners you work with or institutions you work for pushback against activist design strategies. I would say not really, because if they're coming to me, they know what they want. Like then like usually people that I'm working with, I'm gonna be honest, I've never really had that thing that I've gone, because I also like to be a strategist. My goal is not to go too far. It's not to be controversial, to be like, look how intense I am. No, that's not my goal. My goal is different. My goal is to try to be strategic. So usually people are coming to me for very specific sets of projects or issues. I take them on as clients or whatever for that reason. And then we work. However, my work can be weirdly a little bit very dependent on political moments. So I had a lot of work with the NEA in 2015. A lot of that work went away in 2016. And and I wasn't even like the main, it wasn't even about me. It was about just institutions becoming fearful, because it was even before the new administration took over. It was a fear of what was coming and what would be allowed versus not allowed. So it wasn't about me or the work. It was more about like an overall kind of, I don't know, a turn to be safer in their approach, and maybe seeing that some of the money that was once available will be drying up. So that is the part of that work that sometimes can be, especially a lot of the community work ends up being funded by government or nonprofits. So sometimes they also like things like major shifts in the market can cause issues if they all of a sudden are not going to be able to fund that research or that work. So there are moments and places in which this work becomes vulnerable. Same thing actually, and because something else that I have done, which is work within government, actually political winds change within doing government work, and I'm here not even talking the kind of politics that we hear about at a national level. It's more subtle. I'm gonna give you an example, and this affects all of us, but all of a sudden architecture is seen as a luxury, and everything changes, and a new commissioner gets put in place, and suddenly all the work you were doing, investigating guidelines and working on new ways, and this is something else that I've interacted with Kofi on around restorative justice and issues like that, all dries up. It's like how to get a building as quickly as possible, and no more, no less, no more sustainability. None of those things matter. Let's get it done. So it's more about some of those dynamics more than even the bigger politics. But sometimes the bigger politics end up the smaller leading to smaller dynamics in which people just get a little fearful, whether for good reason or not. I'm not sure. But even within that administration, I actually was working with the Department of Labor as well. So it was more that the focus and where the money was coming from shifted more than anything.
Sounds like you're also talking a lot about like perceptions, both as like communities seeing you as an academic or as someone who can get the word out, or the administration or people responding to changes in administration, all these different things kind of coalescing together in these different ways.
And by the way, you mentioned something, the last thing I want to mention, which is that in this kind of work, what you call yourself, and you mentioned this before, I'm a facilitator, citizen. I think that's a very thoughtful and smart thing to do. I mean, I'm not licensed, I'm not officially an architect, but you know, in some communities, saying that I'm an architect goes down really well. Sometimes I just say I'm an artist, sometimes saying I'm like an academic, sometimes just like I'm someone that's concerned and is interested in these issues. And quite honestly, just and the word that means both nothing and sometimes also helps is urbanist, because there's no such thing as an urbanist. There are urban planners, there are specific people. Urbanists don't exist. Urban designers hardly exist.
You live in New York, you can be an urbanist.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that idea of language and presentation, I think you brought that up a couple of times, Evan, is a very important one. Both about how you see yourself within a project and also how it frames how people see you within it.
Appreciate you putting that up. That brings us pretty much through all the questions that we prepared. Kofi, Quilian, how are we doing on time? What does everyone's timeline look like?
Quilian, I know you have a lot of things to do. Do you have a few more minutes?
I have a few more minutes, yeah.
Good. Let's keep going a bit.
Cool. Before we have some extra questions prepared, but wanted to give some space to anyone in the class who anything popped up, any questions that you have for the readings or the conversation that's happened so far. I'll just leave a few seconds for that. Feel free to chime in if you want, and if not, we can keep moving on.
Yeah, I had a question, and I apologize. My dog is probably barking at a delivery truck. But yeah, in your lecture, you mentioned that art has always been way ahead than architecture when it comes to like activism and social justice. So I'm curious if there are any specific ways or arenas that architecture and landscape architecture and planning has advanced, and other arenas that you feel we should try to focus on in our future careers.
Can you say that again? I'm sorry, I missed the second part of the question.
Yeah, if there's arenas that maybe architecture and landscape architecture haven't tapped into quite yet, but will be important for us to focus on in our future careers.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, again, future work, incredibly important. I almost thanked that community group that almost kicked us out of Sunset Park, because it made me really question what urban design was and what it could do. What was it doing? It made me question the kind of dogma of placemaking, and yeah, many of the things that I was even taught at school. And I found that, yeah, I think for urban designers and landscape architects, getting into the political economy of places is going to become more important. And I'm going to urge you that as you do that, that you think about those both as a local, global, regional, and global thing. And that doesn't mean becoming, again, a complete localist. I usually joke, kind of, when I used to teach studio, and people had, you always have projects here in New York and other places about the self-sustaining Manhattan project or something. I'm like, but what happens to the farmer in Nicaragua that really needed to sell you those blueberries to make a living? Is there a place for that? I'm not saying that everything has to be about that. I'm just saying, is there a place for that? Global systems don't have to be thought of or in themselves be evil. There's potentially other ways to think about them, solidarities, etc. So for me, political economy is number one. Obviously, things about climate crises are going to become more and more important. I think that links back to the palette. But one thing is that the shifts that are coming are going to be major. I mean, we're already seeing I think that and I don't know, because some people, like, I know, I think even with Ed, is something that we always talked about. He didn't want to be pessimistic, right? But I do feel like we're almost beyond what we can. I mean, we're beginning to see species in places that don't go. And so how is the world going to change? How is that shift going to change ecosystems, political economies again? And obviously never forgetting people, because people are we're about to go into the biggest moment of migration. I mean, maybe not ever, because people have always migrated. It's one of the interesting things is that things haven't changed that much throughout the history of humans. We've moved around. But I think it's gonna be, we've begun to see it a little bit with Syria, now with the Ukraine, and in some ways these are both obviously wars, but there's some aspects around climate change and resources and some of these things as well. We're seeing it as internally people move from like even temporarily from the coast whenever there's a hurricane, people moving into other places. I always bring it back to Ohio, but Ohio was, you would hear all the time how it's an area that's gonna suffer relatively little, and it has a lot of water and has the infrastructure for about 2 or 3 times of the population it has right now. So what would it mean there? And one of the questions with that is, would it drive inequality even more intensely? So does that mean that, for example, because like, you know, actually Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs were buying up everything in Ohio. That's one of the things that the oligarchs were. So yeah, so what does that mean? Who benefits as we move forward? I think those sets of questions are going to be interesting. And besides those 2 things, I think those are the 2 biggest things. Is how we're going to cope with what's coming, both at an environmental and social level, and the political economies that it requires. And maybe just because there are things here that I'm not seeing. It's like, for example, what are some of the lessons what are some other atmospheres around urban design that are just not maybe being emphasized enough? Transportation, maybe health. I feel like health, and again, because we're gonna get a species of animals and insects in places that we didn't get to. Well, is that going to shift things? Those sets of questions.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing your time with us today.
Oh, thank you.
Anybody else want to jump in with anything? Burning questions, thoughts, things that come to mind? Right on. Well, I can go ahead and ask one of the follow-up questions that we had. And if anybody thinks of something, feel free to jump in. I'm not going to go ahead and share my screen. I like looking at people, but I'll read it out and I can post it in the chat in just a second. But the question is, do you use your teaching experience and opportunities to showcase an impact at a real-world level for engaging communities rather than solely at a conceptual level? How have you been able to demonstrate that within a studio environment? So I guess thinking back to your role as an educator and kind of communicating that out to people you're working with, students, collaborators.
Yeah, no, I tend to see, so this is an interesting question because I do see, so there's a couple of models. So I've taught planning at Pratt. I taught urban design for planners, basically. And Pratt, I don't know if you guys know the Pratt Center. The Pratt Center invented the Community Development Corporation, for example. They were one of the first community design centers, a real place where tons of innovations and ideas have come up with. They have a model which is that is clientelistic in nature. They have partnerships with groups that go decades. They're deep in it. It's not light. And to even like do any studio, you have to request permission and like work with the groups, etc. But sometimes that clientelistic model, I find that can be problematic. That in the way they do it, and I'm talking about them, but I'm not really critiquing what they do because I like what they do a lot. Is more about sometimes other places where I've seen where all of a sudden you feel like you are in a firm and you have a client. I'm not sure about that model. That model can be bad. It also might promise things to people that you know maybe. I feel like students should be given the opportunity to try things, fail, to throw things at the wall and get it right, wrong. We can guess, but that is all that really I feel that we should. So then the issue becomes about how to ground it. And I don't think that grounding it means that, and again, the sets of questions of like, because, and forgive me if I'm saying in a weird way, but it's the kind of critique that I heard. So I'm sometimes like in responding to a critique that even though it's not being said, but it's like, just do what the community said. No, that's not really what we're doing. So what I like to do is find an issue, an urban, and the bid was a big one. For example, it was something that was already part of the research I was doing. It really kind of exposed a lot of really interesting things. And one of the things that I loved is that it exposed urban policy as a design. So that's something else maybe for the last question as well. For Jen's question is that the idea of cities are changing, yet the policies from the 70s are still there. And I think that's incredibly important to even understand the politics of the last 5 to 10 years. And what does that mean? The bid at the end of the day, again, making the city a mall is an ideological idea. An idea that comes from a very specific moment in time of fear of, like it's very, so, and it has led to a very specific kind of urban environment. And so anyway, so throw students into a real case, not partner with tons of people, be where people are, but not anyone so that they think that what we're doing is going to solve all the issues. No, we're just, and then observe, be part of the larger process. Don't think that we're gonna solve it because there was nothing to solve per se, but rather like we were gonna hopefully add something. And in that case, students came up with games that helped people that didn't speak English, for example, understand better what this policy even meant and ways to skirt it. And something else about the studio that I always found that, because I also have heard this, that sometimes putting students in real life situations, what happens with students that are coming from other cities, states, countries, that studio was 99% people that had just arrived in the United States. And within 2 weeks, they were friends with all the activists in Queens. So I don't know, like, and it just, I don't know. Maybe it's a specific group of students, because I honestly don't feel like I did anything special except made the connections possible, and made and framed the question in a way that made those group of students be hungry to go and understand things better. So anyway, so I think it's important to do that. We did a little bit of that with in Huff in Cleveland as well. And the last example I'll share is there was a studio called Index Studio in Kent State that was given to me, which was interesting, which tried to look at an issue in Ohio and internationally. And what they had done in the past is that they basically did most of the work either in this international site, or they allowed the students to choose. So maybe it was a thematic of development around rivers. I actually asked each student to have a big idea, a big research topic, and then to do a project in both sites. And they compared Warren, Ohio to Curitiba, Brazil. Trying to understand how, not that it would be the same project, but how the same idea could be mutated, transformed to talk about social political issues. So
yeah, it's really interesting.
One idea, two projects.
No, that's cool. I mean, I think the idea of coupling, I think that global, regional, local, it's a real conversation in terms of what we can learn from each other, setting expectations, What is the role of someone with technical expertise and knowledge working with the community? What do you consider success? How can the academy and the groups that aren't quote unquote professionals really add value and contribute? So it's covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate it. Are there any other questions for Quilian while we have them?
I have a quick question. There's a good amount of us, maybe only a few of us in this class, who are not designers. We are not architects. We're not studying that. And I'm curious, like, how you would advise or recommend for us to be engaged in the design process of our communities from a non-design perspective, and like not actually being the architects, but still engaging. And from your experience, how do you wish non-designers would have interacted with you, other professionals could have interacted with these projects, and maybe what you would suggest for us?
The really interesting question, Kelsey, because I mostly have taught design, etc. I'm gonna share of experiences with you that sometimes design doesn't have to be like, for example, building or landscape, etc. And I persons in the problem of, oh, did I lose them? Can you guys see me still?
Yeah, you were cutting out for a bit.
It is breaking up, but yeah, we can see it.
If it happens again, I'll switch to my phone. My phone hotspot. Sometimes this happens. Okay. I used to teach a program that was basically using design as a methodology, not as an outcome. And this is typical now. Nothing at this point is nothing groundbreaking, because you know what it looks like? It's like one of those detective shows. It's just lots of lines, or that meme where they got Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, or the base, the killer's basement, and any of those things. It was just basically just tons of, it was basically ways using design to organize information, find moments of, and try to act on them. So I mean, I think generally, obviously, the number one thing I think that would still stand is go find the folks that are doing the work that you think should be done and see what you can do. But the other way that to use design that in potentially is that strategy part, that is not designed as an outcome, but designed as a process about thinking systematically about an issue. Something as a way to uncover, not that things, this is not like a conspiracy theory kind of thing, but it's like things are hit, like, again, business improvement districts, we all know it, but we don't know it, and it's hard to understand. So having a visual, quick way of understanding it is helpful. So that kind of thing. I would also send you to the work of the Center for Urban Pedagogy, perhaps one of the best. Do you know them? They here in New York City, they basically use, again, design as a process. They basically try to make policy come alive, create comic books out of it, try to talk to students and explain. Yeah, I think CUP is another one. These kind of groups also are, even the program I was teaching at Parsons, because of that, now there's kind of internal service design programs within governments, but at the federal level and here in New York City. And I know Boston has an incredible one with an ex-student of mine that just, I think she's amazing. Where they call the urban mechanics, something for urban mechanics. And they're looking again at systems of engagement, at systems of thinking about things rather than finishing them. So I think that some of these civic groups, some of these groups are finding ways to do this at a civic level. It could be also good places.
Thank you.
Yeah, the new urban mechanics. And Sabrina, Sabrina was a next student of mine that works there, and she did an amazing project in Medellin, Colombia. And she's mostly a cartoonist, really.
I love that. Comics and cartoons are how I got into all of this. So I love comic books, graphic novels, whatever you want to call them. Well, good. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I know Quilian's got 5 other jobs he's got to get to before going to bed, but we're really thankful for you spending time with us today. Your great, detailed and thoughtful answers to all the questions. Thank the students for the questions. And Quilian, I'll see you in person in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Okay.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's get back to it. Put a link to the slides I'm going to share in the chat, so please check that out. Before we move on, is there anything else, any other reflections or observations about our time with Quilian? I thought the questions were handled well, so thank you for that in the discussion. He's a tough critic, so a compliment from him is a good thing. So you all did well. I'm gonna share my screen, and part of the agenda is for today, I wanna help you continue to work on your case study work. I have had a chance to review all the written proposals. I've viewed all of the panel discussions, and if you look in the folder where you submitted, everyone should have comments on their documents. If you don't, let me know. But I did take the time to read them all, so thank you for doing that. And there were some systemic things that I thought would be helpful to have a conversation with you all about moving forward. And also, we did talk about last week dealing with the legacy of Curitiba, Brazil, and Jaime Lerner in particular, as it relates to our broader topic right now, which is dealing with equity and the planning scale, and remains an exemplar, an incredible case study of how that occurred at the provocation of design, with a shocking footnote to it, but still is regarded as one of the great leaders and the power of good planning and design. Are you all able to see my screen? All right, let's move through. Some questions. Everyone wasn't explicit about what equity issue they were taking on. In some cases, it was very broad. So I would encourage you to look at examples, reference some of the examples shared in class or your own research to come at a more narrow definition of what type of equity you're looking for. There was a lot of interest in, for example, with public spaces, how investment in public space impacts private space, either from the standpoint of increasing private property values and fueling gentrification and displacement, or enabling businesses by people who don't have a lot of access. So that's just one example. We've talked through methods that deal with access, that deal with health, that deal with the uses in the places and in the parks, in which case, direct engagement with people there is really critical. But I think just generally, just a revisit to make sure that you're looking at it from a certain point of view, which leads to a definition, right? Equity doesn't mean the same thing for all of us. And in some cases, as you're looking at your cases and precedents and other examples of how it was framed, it's okay to borrow other people's definitions, especially if they're evidence-based. So this is one of those things that's important, and for the purposes of the project. So I think that would help. Based on that definition, who's the most vulnerable to changes in that particular environment? Vulnerability also connects with opportunity. From a design and planning standpoint, we don't just stay with vulnerability, but not everyone is affected by places in the same way. So sometimes even narrowing in on who the particular types of folks are that you're most interested in there were broad comments to race, to economics, issues of gender, our equity issues, age, English is not your first language in the United States. There's a whole litany of different types of folks who might be most affected by places. So it might be possible to do a little dive into that. If you're able to do archival research in the place that you're working on and identify groups that are generally underserved or marginalized by broader decisions, you can start to take that model and start to drill down and talk about how those folks might be affected by the places. Indicators. So how do we know that something's had an effect? How do we measure changes? Let's say, for example, you're successful in identifying an equity issue, a vulnerable population. What are the indicators that let us know it's a signal? So that might be another opportunity for references, and we'll share some later in the lecture in terms of those. And I'd like for you to think about these questions as we start to talk about Curitiba. There's a short 15-minute video that I'd like for you all to watch. It's sort of a short documentary about Jaime Lerner's influence in particular on changes there. But as you're watching it, think about these questions because they'll come up as topics are there. Who are you involving in the evaluative process? I think a lot of what we've talked about has been involving community, and in some cases, the most vulnerable to changes in that process. And I think that that's a great idea. It may not always be required. So there are some that you'll see that are based on interpretations from archival research, geospatial analysis, other tools. I like that so many of you really talked about the DIY toolkit and what was being promoted by Reimagined in the Civic Commons and that great work. It is great work. But in some cases, you won't get the answers that you're looking for because it assumes that the people that you're engaging with have access to the same tools and information that you do. And in some cases, that is hard to come by. And in some cases, it's a totally different thing, which is to say, maybe your process is about building people's capacity to understand how to read geospatial and GIS information, or how to do archival research, or how to engage in observational studies of how people are using places. I think that's great. But also, I would say don't substitute community engagement for everything. And so it is helpful to understand how things have changed over time, how to deploy some of the skill sets you all have as one, but not the entire piece of the pie as you evaluate. So, just some thoughts as I looked through the slide presentations and saw the panels and read the cases, and tying it back to some of the things we talked about in class. Framing what you're investigating is important. Communicating the indicators based on that, like what are you looking for in terms of indicators of equity or inequity. Seeking out collaborators. So even if we don't know right now, that's okay. That just the impetus to say, hey, we have to co-create this with people, and where possible with the people who are most vulnerable to the changes. Experiential character. In some cases, you all were using aerials and maps and other things to convey what it was like being in those places. And I think you have the ability to either in person, if you're able to, get on the ground and take some pictures to let us know what it feels like there. Or if that's not possible through other senses. But I think the experience of being there and being able to communicate that is important, not just the top-down technical information. Geospatial as needed and archival as needed, particularly history and archives and things of that nature. So, those are a few things that, just hitting bases in terms of how you're approaching it, that could be in your toolkit. And they're like a graphic equalizer. You may not spend the same amount of effort or energy on all of them, but I think it's helpful to start thinking about more than one way to start to document and grab information. With that, I want to move to video, and I want to encourage you all to hit the link and watch the 15-minute video on YouTube. But Jaime Lerner, really a visionary who, as a young architect, was elected mayor of Curitiba, Brazil. And in a matter of not decades, not even months, in a matter of weeks, completely transformed an entire city through extremely bold planning and design decisions designed to produce equitable outcomes for vulnerable populations of people living in that current city. So still remains sort of an icon of that. He used his architecture and urban design and planning thinking to think at multiple scales. So not just at the scale of a building or even a street, but at the regional scale, and proposed regional transportation systems, regional food systems, regional open space systems, regional stormwater and resilience systems, at a speed that we usually don't associate with the scale of what we do. That has produced lasting benefits to people and has been built upon. So as opposed to other cities and communities where these big, bold plans, for example, did more harm than good and failed and were erased, they're resilient in terms of what he's dealt with. This is just a picture of, the 2014, 2015 master plan. A lot of the work he did was in the 1970s and 1980s, that they're still building off of some of the structures that were developed there. So it's a very different perspective on how to achieve equitable outcomes at the city scale, but I think something that will be useful as you consider your versions. So what I would encourage you to do, if you have the presentation open, is hit the link. The video that is the documentary summarizing what he did in Curitiba is about 15 minutes long, and we'll reconvene right after that and have a brief conversation before we go to the conclusion of tonight's class. Right, so I wish I could still share YouTube on Zoom, but it won't let me. So you all are gonna have to watch it on your own. So we'll see you in about 15 minutes. All right, coming back. Hopefully you've had a chance to watch the video. Any reactions?
It seems so, it makes a lot of sense and just also seems so implausible to replicate, even though I know it was done. Just is oh, well, yeah, of course, but then how? I guess is where I'm sitting.
Yeah, that's a good question. Others?
We need to get some sheep for Dick's Park.
Agreed. Agreed. Goats and sheep are our friends.
I'm curious how this design could, I don't, have you done any research into Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, and its design?
I have indeed, yes.
I lived there for a little bit and it felt very felt like there was a lot of work put into it, but then there was nothing fruitful about it. And I'm just curious about comparing it to, I don't know who designed it, but for the this city, when I was there, I'd never heard of it. I mean, I'd heard of it, but I didn't go south. But to then think about the capital of Brazil and how much it could benefit from his consulting. And maybe he did consult it. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't speak too much, but.
So did you live in the central part of Brasilia, or were you on the edges?
No, you can't live in the central part of Brasilia.
Right, exactly.
Right. There was nowhere. I was on the streets for a few days when I arrived because there was nowhere to stay. It was incredible. We slept in the park in a tent with other people because there was nowhere to go. And eventually you had to go out about an hour from the actual capital, which it was a new design, a new city, and it was so incredibly not accessible.
Right.
Um,
What took you to Brasilia?
that was eventually where I was flying out of. So I went there, and
Okay.
the person I was traveling with was also seeking, he's Colombian and was seeking his residency documents. So we went there to go through that process.
Gotcha. So
But
Brasilia was designed by an architect named Oscar Niemeyer. And Niemeyer was a follower of Le Corbusier, which I know some of you were participating in an event this week, challenging that floor, but had similar philosophies. But in the case of Niemeyer, the city plan literally is an airplane. So in the manner of what do you choose to be inspired by to create form, and in Corbusian way, the idea that the leading forms of technology at that time. Well, when Corbusier was practicing, it was planes and trains, and so a lot of the innovations that came from the mass production of those vehicles were applied to architectural settings. So yeah, Brasilia, new capital city, whole cloth, is when you look at it from the air, is literally an airport. And when you think about it, it was, and all of the buildings are sculptural, right? So it's like a park-like setting, and the buildings individually are stunning. Like if you're into modernism, it's a really high bar. But in terms of the realities of lived experience, no, it's a bummer. And as you stated, Kelsey, we had a student here several years ago who grew up in Brasilia, but grew up in the favelas, self-built communities on the edges, like never went into it'd be the equivalent of living in Washington, D.C., but if the whole city were designed as the National Mall. And so people self-built next to the National Mall rather than having an actual city. It's that kind of parallel. So Lerner is operating in the same period of time, but Brasilia was an existing city. It was more of an industrial city. So the work that he was doing was trying to make it more livable. The caveat, which I'm not sure if it came through in the video, was that Brazil was a fascist dictatorship at the time that he was there. And in his own words, he said he wouldn't be able to achieve what he did if he had to go through a democratic process. So it's a very different way of thinking about affecting change. The brilliant individual, sort of the stereotype of the super architect, descending and doing everything from transportation systems to trash for food, for floodplain technology. Like it was all coming out of his brain, right? But there's been a lot of harm done in that way too. And in the lecture notes, there's a link to a contemporary thought on how Brasilia is doing today. And unfortunately, because of a lot of other factors, there's a lot of issues. And I would just apologize to the whole group that a lot of his language and cultural views were dated. So when you start hearing like first world, mother-in-law, you're kind of like, So I'm not endorsing that part. But I am saying that things have changed. And generally with Curitiba, it's followed the path of a lot of Brazil, where they radically deregulated everything for exploitation of natural resources, of labor. It's really kind of sad, actually. So current indicators, all the things he was trying to do, improve water quality, reduce pollution, increase urbanization, keep people in the city, it's all kind of flipped now. So it's sad, but at the time, revolutionary, and for decades stood as a great towering example. But you can hear in the way he talked about it and in that video, the indicators, like how do you determine what you're focusing on? He focused on systems. He focused on what he had purview and control of regarding the public realm. And he focused on things like hunger, exposure to flood risk, food access and security, those sorts of things. And so I just want to encourage you to think about, as you're looking at your own cases, to zero in a bit more as you move forward. Right. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So in some cases, it links you to information and framing that you don't have to do. So it'll be interesting now to reflect on your cases and then look at what's out there in terms of indicators. The National Equity Atlas, which is heavily informed by PolicyLink, an excellent organization that focuses mostly on racial equity. But with regards to National Equity Atlas, you'll see there are a lot of different indicators and signs to it. So there's a link here for that. In terms of their indicators, they have many, and they have a rationale and a methodology that's associated with each of them. You know, demographic indicators, like what do you look for if you're trying to figure out who's most vulnerable to a particular kind of change that's happening. Economic indicators, and there are a number of you who've talked about that in terms of wages, jobs, business ownership, home ownership. They've already started to frame these out and can link you to cases and examples and methods from many places. What they call readiness, now this is something that they made up in terms of a term, but bundles together the skill development, the preparation, educational attainment. There are competing theories about combating poverty, but the past few administrations have really focused on investing and preparing the next generation to participate in the economy. So investments in education have been a big deal. They've spent a lot of time thinking about that. Connectedness, in terms of combating social isolation. As a metric, you know, connecting from place to place, access to mobility. Sadly, it's just car access, you know, so no one metric is the best. There are other ways of dealing with mobility that, you know, cars and fossil fuels are not the way that we want to move forward generally as a society. So, you know, with limits. And economic benefits. So the thought is, as you start to look, you know, at your own work, is to start to compare what you're looking at versus what others have looked at in terms of indicators, and see if you can learn from those particular lessons. There is one organization that's directly focused with recreation and parks and open space in our country, National Recreation and Parks Association, the acronym NERPA. They've worked quite a bit in the last decade or so to build up an equity approach to their work as they start to deal with those and develop, you know, methods and approaches and tools. This is just an excerpt from their recommendations from national study about building an equitable park master plan. You know, so this is just, you know, an example, but you'll start to see, you know, some key steps that could be can inform or support the methods that you're dealing with. So, you know, some assessment, you need some kind of baselining of how things are working. You know, that's usually data driven and interacting with people who are most vulnerable to changes. Engagement for sure, but also it values resources and data collection. So the ability to kind of build that in into your process. They also have a step of implementation, which is not something that we're asking for in this particular assignment, but just to let you know, it's not just arm waving and paper on the shelf. The goal is, you know, the real metric is when things change and you really start to get actual facilities in the ground, you know, that you're kind of honoring that. And they have a nice link to case studies. They have it sorted by a scale of community. So there are different tabs along the top that range from communities that are less than 50,000 people to communities over 250,000. So you'll be able to see if your community that you're studying is in any of those ranges, you know, you might be able to discover that there are other examples that you can look at in terms of how they framed out their process. And the Trust for Public Land, Park Score Index. So a very criticized measure, I'll say. As are a lot of data-driven and archival ones that don't always engage people. So making prescriptions about things or assumptions about things without actually being on the ground has a lot of problems with it. However, as a component, you know, it's something that could be useful as you start to look at it. Park score, the higher the number, the quote unquote better your park system is in a particular community. This example of Durham, 82 in the country, which is about in the middle. Like, it sounds horrible, but it's sort of in the middle. Some of their criteria are interesting. If you go there and you type in the city that you're interested in, just to see how it works, they have layers and they have a variety of factors. This one is looking at downtown Durham. And that green square in the middle is the CCB Plaza, the dark green circle. So you'll see on the left, with layers, you can turn them off and on, but it starts to give you a logic in terms of how they determine equity with regards to at least park access. There were some of you that were looking at comparisons, looking at things over time, how a place has changed. One tool, it's not available to everybody. I know you all have sites that are international. It'll be interesting to see how it works. Is using the historical imagery or the timeline in Google Earth as to reflect what's there now per this tool and what was once there. So if you are interested in this, it's for people who don't know about this, it's a free download. It's only a Google Pro option. There's a tab near the top that says view. If you click on it, there's a tab underneath that says historical imagery. And when you click on historical imagery, it pops, a timeline pops out in the upper left. And it will show you aerial imagery as far back as it can archive it in the exact same place. So in this case, I think this might be useful to some of you because in your written narrative and in your presentations, you refer to what was there before, what's there now. The ability to grab images that are roughly the same scale in the same place and show, what was there will help with conveying why that's important. So that's the area now. That red circle indicates where I was investigating, which is that CCB Plaza area, because Durham went through history, but this is really interesting because it's from 1990. So this shows like the speed of change. If you've been to Durham, the streetscapes, the new plazas, the open spaces, even parts of Durham Central Park did not exist. Like a lot of this has happened in the last 15 years. And what was once CCB Plaza, now CCB Plaza was a parking lot. It used to be the Duke Hotel, which burned down in the post-war and was literally a surface parking lot, even when I moved to the area. For some folks, archival research become important. So if you're in a community that had a place and they went through a planning process, finding an entity that might have that plan so you can see it or see where these came from. This is, if you're in Durham, Downtown Durham Incorporated has been the sort of entity that's public-private partnership that's managed growth in downtown, and they have access to all their reports going back to the 90s. So you can get a sense of, in this particular community, the assumptions that led to the place, which is to say, sometimes it's helpful to see what goals they laid out before they did it, right? To then come back around and say, you can do it a couple ways. It could be a critique, because in a lot of this stuff in the 90s, quite frankly, issues of equity and justice were not common conversations in most, at least American cities, right? It was more of, combating suburbanization and trying to make downtowns and city centers as attractive as possible for developers and investors. The push for equity was there, but it wasn't always apparent in some of these plans. So, you start to dig through, and in 1990, you see like the first sketch of what CCB Plaza was supposed to be and changes to infrastructure and a lot of different stuff. And you see, the existing condition, and then you see how it changed, right? So at a minimum, I think it would be great to find some archival work that shows the place that you're looking at. And if time is a factor, in some cases, time is not a factor. The fact that it's changed is not important in everybody's case, and that's okay. But if you are, I would encourage you to start to find ways of representing that kind of change. And then eye level stuff, this is me being lazy. I got thousands of pictures of downtown Durham because that was the big hangout for my kids when they were younger. So I know all this stuff. I was lazy. I grabbed a street view from Google Earth. But you can tell the difference, right? If everything is just data and aerials and we don't get a sense of where we are, what it feels like, scale, what's happening out there, we lose something in the storytelling. So I would encourage you all to at least find one image that shows us what this place is like on the ground. Archival research can help in a lot of different So as you all are saying, hey, I wish I could look up, development decisions and where things happen, you'll find that there might be entities that are there. So business associations, planning departments, economic development wings, redevelopment, if you're in North Carolina, other entities might already have some of this information that you can take a look at. Many years ago, we had some students looking at this particular area that did some of this work. So Brian and Carly and Wan Long, they had some very specific questions and interests, right? So they were looking at, how to activate this particular place. Like why at that time when they first built this place, and this is 2016 when it opened, it wasn't a 24-hour place, right? So a lot of the businesses that people enjoy that are on the edges of it now weren't there. The hotel that anchors it on the south side, the Museum 21C, was not there. So they were thinking about equity from the standpoint of how do we get people from different walks of life and different backgrounds engaged there. So we don't need the design component of this, but it's just an illustration of how they started to frame and talk about the issue, providing context, letting you know where the study area is in relation to, major landmarks, historical information. That's actually the Washington Duke Hotel there that burned and was demolished in 1924, demolished in 1975. So they went digging through photos, and I'm trying to imagine that, like standing on the edge of Durham and seeing the tower come down. That's pretty crazy. I did see the convention center come down in Raleigh. That's happened since I've been here. So they dynamited that thing too. So we sat on the steps of the former state capitol at the end of Fayetteville Street and saw it go down. The convention center. This is more of a deep dive, but they really spent a lot of time tracking down, who was involved. One of our alumni in particular was involved, Susan Hatchell, who has an office and a practice in Raleigh. So they were able to contact her, and get some of the backstory about it. That's not required for your study, but as an illustration of a step, right? That part of my process might be tracking down who actually designed this thing, having a conversation with them about what their goals were, their expectations. So you don't need to actually do that for your study, but I think recommending that where appropriate is a good idea. Power, right? Who really decided? So an example is, you'll discover that there was either an influential individual, there was a group, there was some kind of push that said that, hey, this needs to happen. Either we need to create this or we need to change this. Having something that talks about that. I mean, Quilian talked about the political economy is to suggest that politics don't stop at the doorstep of capitalism. They kind of go together. So there were probably some other interests involved. So some sort of political analysis in some of these cases might be important, particularly if you're thinking about were people disenfranchised in the process, were they included, are they receiving benefits? Some of that happened like way before things changed there. On and on, you can look at these, at your leisure. It's more than what is required for this particular assignment, but I wanted to visualize people who took this premise of, well, how would we read this space? And then in their case, they went further and tried to develop, strategies to determine what's missing, what cases they might look at, and even being bold enough to propose changes. So we're not doing that. But I just wanted to show sort of a full play of variables out there. There's some points here. Yes, Sanborn map imagery is great for historic imagery. So Katie's point is right. Just going through the chat. Co-responsibility, part interesting. Yes, I agree, Laura. Might be off topic, but I found interesting how the government gave the poor populations an incentive to clean up their surroundings in return for things they needed. Yes. Why other governments don't implement these equations of responsibility. My understanding is that they, a couple of decades ago, they were doing that in a number of cities, particularly in the US. So Bay Area. I've heard about Portland, in particular, having some of those strategies. Good job moving these individuals to better living situations. Reclaim wetland compared to other examples I've learned about. Yeah, Pruitt-Igoe is a whole nother thing. Yeah, so I'll send a link to that. So Katie, I don't know if you've seen the Pruitt-Igoe myth. It's a really good film documentary about the legacy of a modernist public housing project that was demolished because they were convinced that the actual physical design of this development was feeding deep inequality, crime, and actually literally harming people. So they literally blew it up in St. Louis, and that site is still vacant, like to this day. It's been vacant for over 50 years. It's a really terrible thing, but it was the tipping point. It sent off a domino of questioning all this modernist architecture stuff, saying maybe we've just been doing the whole thing wrong, and it changed the political tenor in our country to where we are now, which is different. But Sanborn maps, yes, they're free access through NC State's library system online. Sanborn fire insurance maps, again, Bay Area, San Francisco burned down. The Sanborn Fire Insurance Company volunteered to hand draw survey documents so that people could make insurance claims and rebuild. And then they marketed that service across the country. So you'll find from like the early 20th century until about World War II, very detailed maps to scale of what was there at those periods of time. So if you're really doing a deep dive in really early 20th century history, they're really an invaluable resource because they tell you who owned it. They'll tell you densities and if they're single or multiple occupancy. They'll even locate things like infrastructure, like sewers and water mains. It's a really incredible archive that many cities that had, I would say, more than 50,000 people in the early 20th century, there's probably a Sanborn map for that thing. So it's a really incredible thing that's free for all of us. I wanted to close with an example, and I think we're going to have to reschedule our field study, which was supposed to be this weekend, and I think we should go to South Park. Originally, we were going to go to Dix Park, but I think we should go to Southeast Raleigh for a number of reasons. This is an image. We've been working with the South Park community for over a decade now, particularly focusing on public space and open space. It is southeast of downtown. In the upper left of this diagram, you can see the old Capitol building. On the north, Hargett Street. On the south, Martin Luther King Boulevard. And on the east, the boundary on the right, Tarboro Road. So we spend a lot of time there. And it's a space or place where open space is really important. So we did a studio a couple years ago looking at connecting a number of open spaces that are there, starting with the city cemetery, the city's original cemetery at the north on Hargett Street, going through Winters Park, down Chavis Way, and to the edges of Chavis Park. So we'll plan the proper field study before the end of the semester, but it's a very walkable community. It's very, there's a lot of contrasts in terms of, everything about it. It is one of the historic African-American communities on the edges of downtown. Also has been in the news, right? So this is Emily Badger's great article about gentrification. And so for people who are interested in that topic, the New York Times actually came up with their own way of defining what constitutes gentrification and displacement. It'll be very interesting for you all to think about their method and the cities that appeared. So one thing I find fascinating is Raleigh, based on their measurement, the most gentrifying city in the country at the time of the writing of this article. That was their conclusion, right? There are other ways of defining it, but from that standpoint, I was kind of shocked when they produced that. The work we attempted to do was slow. So Chalen Pashalar, who some of you know, and myself and a number of others worked on the Heritage Walk to try and help tell the cultural stories of the neighborhood through public space. There's a political backstory to it, which we can get into. We did a field study, but that was the long and the short of it. How do we really communicate the cultural significance of these spaces in the public realm? It led to some innovations, including using smartphone devices to help people tell their stories and use that as evidence for attracting resources and changing policy. And the self-guided route, the orange line here that connects these major open spaces, is the quote unquote Heritage Walk. It's about just under 2 miles and connects many of the major entities there. One of the wins from this was the Chavis Park joining the National Register of Historic Places. John Chavis Memorial Park, formerly known as the Negro Park, the parallel, separate but equal facility to Pullen Park, which at the time of its founding was for whites only, had the exact same facilities as Pullen Park, even though it's almost a mile away, but specifically for African Americans. Renamed through advocacy John Chavis Memorial Park because of a Black teacher, African American teacher, who lived in that community, the first Black teacher in the state to be able to educate both Black and white citizens. The point I'm making is that the image on the right is the city developed master plan update for changes to Chavis Park. The image on the left is the community-based one that we all led, and they're about the same. It's interesting because the influence that these local people had in shaping that plan. There's more to it. In the interest of time, I won't spend a lot of time because we're running out of time today. The park, among other things, was one of the first places where the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was founded at Shaw University right next to Chavis Park by Ella Baker, and many others, was a place where they trained people, particularly Black women, in nonviolent direct action techniques, including how to defend themselves from hostile attacks when they went moving. This picture is from Mississippi, but it's a similar scene as what occurred in Chavis Park. It's covered in a Landscape Architecture magazine article, that particular process. In terms of indices for us, we're like, well, what are the indicators? We looked at a lot of stuff, racial segregation. So Raleigh is interesting because there was not redlining in Raleigh, right? There was no homeowners loan corporation mapping, assigning grades to different communities for their access to loans based on race. That didn't happen in Raleigh. However, historically in Raleigh, there's a sort of southeast northwest divide, right through the middle of downtown. So, percent African American, household size, rental units, vacant units, household income. There are a ton of indicators. On the left shows other indicators which come from the era of urban renewal, or in the South, redevelopment. In which case, Martin Luther King Boulevard didn't exist until after World War II. And the creation of Martin Luther King Boulevard, ironically, severed a lot of historical connections north-south, connecting South Park and downtown to other parts of Southeast Raleigh, which has resulted in fragmentation in that particular community. So sometimes that time map going from 1939 to today showing changes like the increase in streets and automobile infrastructure and other elements helps to tell sort of a story of the impact, at least in this case, of infrastructure on the quality of life. So, in this case, we looked at public infrastructure. We looked at a lot of demographics as some of our indicators, in which case the success kind of comes from that. We looked at policies, right? And realized that how the community self-identified their boundary didn't really match any other boundaries, right? So neighborhood conservation overlays, historic district designation, all these other things were just bits and pieces that were tied to politics, but not the lived experience of people. So one of the political things that the Heritage Walk did was it responded to what people reported as their lifestyle and their interests and their needs and their meaning as a way to kind of overlay and overlap with those. different strategies. A lot of different ways of doing it. Traditional workshops. Kermit Bailey, for people who are into college design, he's a professor in graphic design. Spend a lot of time doing deep archival research, going into people's crawl spaces and attics, going through yearbooks, producing these really elegant things called knowledge maps, which really talked about people's attachment to artifacts that represent and had meaning to them that they could extend to the broader community. It's a really unique approach. On-site stuff, that's an Easter egg roll in the lower left-hand corner to engage kids, which tied to historic events in a particular park, and then the cell phone work with social media. So we did a lot of different things. Yeah, we'll just move through this just in the interest of time. Since all that occurred, they got $17.5 million in a bond issue to transform in first phase Chavis Park. So today there's a new recreation center and investments. And in the next bond issue that goes through, they're going to complete the master plan and extend the funding to then begin implementing the Heritage Walk. So we're all excited that it's not just like a paper document that's just sitting there. It's in real time being grappled with the city, but in the context of this broader move of reinvestment in the city and the vulnerability of people to changes, particularly in home ownership and the risk of gentrification and displacement. So we'll use this as sort of a talking guide. There's a link in the presentation if you want to read the whole document before we go on our field study. But it was weighing whether or not to do Dix Park or do South Park. I think that South Park has more to offer right now. And it actually starts to embody a lot of the issues that are coming out, at least in your descriptions of your case studies and your panel work. Reason why I can't do it this weekend or next weekend, excuse me, is next weekend is our summit. So on Saturday we'll be at the National Building Museum, grappling with issues related to the Green New Deal and how to help our profession be more engaged in design and policy and advocacy work. So it'll be a great day in DC. There's a few hundred people coming, and we hope to come out of it with some useful things that I will gladly bring back to all of you. So, but we will find a time to do our second field study. So just wanted to introduce that. All right, so a couple missions today. One was really, again, thanks for the good questions. Quilian, I think he offered a lot of great input, food for thought, perspective, experience regarding our purview and our roles in various things to recover some of what we've seen regarding the case study work and the panel work. And that would be the message I would give to you is to perhaps narrow a bit and to think about indicators built into your process so that you have a sense of what are we looking for, what's the baseline, and how do I know if things are going to change. It's helpful to kind of pin that down a bit, and that you don't have to invent it. You can reference standards that we know are out there. To encourage you to think about if you are interested in change over time, to reflect that in your work. Yeah, I think that was my plate for today. Are there any comments or questions before we say goodbye this evening? All right, if not, have a good evening.
Thank you, Kofi.